The meeting is called open at 8:25. Do we go with a whereas already, Mr. Mayor? No, we have to follow the agenda. Fine. Can't promise I will, Mr. Mayor. All right. Mr. Mayor, we do have the agenda before us, and we do have a presentation also ahead of us tonight. When he steps in, we should all applaud him, really. Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, yes. What a grand idea. He's going to be walking on a cloud. Oh, please. Please. Adoption of the agenda, folks? I move that the agenda be adopted as presented. Seconded. I have something to add. Hold on a minute. I told you, folks. It's just slip in with his agenda item right away. Go ahead. Mr. Bouchard, do you have anything else to add? Well, we could remove the notice of motion at 6.1. Why don't you put it in at 6.3? All right, I'll put it in at 6.3 then. Notice of motion. I don't need to read it, do I? Just relate the subject.
That's it.
All right. We'll just leave things like that. That's in regard to culverts. Yes. Yes. We'll add it on to 6.3. Anything else? All those in favor? Carried. Thank you. Disclosures of pecuniary interests? None. Fine. Delegations and presentations. Presentation by Andrew Mirabella from Hampson concerning preliminary development charges. Mr. Mirabella, do you speak French? Just before Mr. Mirabella starts the presentation, we'll talk about the infrastructure that will be forwarded through the land planning study that has been conducted. You don't have all of the materials because they'll be distributed at the end of the meeting. Now, we'll be meeting with all developers, talking to them with the changes with regards to development charges, and then we'll meet with council again after the meeting with the developers has occurred so that you'll be aware of any charges on capital projects. Welcome to council.
My name is Andrew Mirabella. I'm a senior consultant at Hampson Consulting. We were retained by the city to undertake your development charges background study in an effort to pass a new bylaw for the city before the existing one expires. The intention of today's meeting is purely just an information session for council. As part of our process here, obviously keeping staff, council, as well as the developers and the development community well informed throughout the process. So again, just an information meeting to present some of the results that we have tabled and we have come up with, and there'll be subsequent opportunities once the background study is tabled, as once there's further information with the development community, as well as a public process which is statutory under the requirements of the Act. So just with that said, I guess a few things that we do want to discuss today. I'll get some background, just a little bit on development charges and what they are. Understandably, I'm sure you're quite familiar with them. Unfortunately for yourselves, I'm going to have a little bit of an extended presentation. Depends on your definition of unfortunate. As Bill 108 has recently come about, there's some information that I think you should be aware of in terms of some new legislation, some of the requirements around it, and how it's going to affect the city of Clarence-Rockland on a go-forward basis, and the way we've structured our development charges at this particular time. Then we'll get into a little bit of the actual calculation and the methodology, look at the development forecast, a summary of the development-related capital programs, and to Frederick's point, there'll be I guess a more detailed capital listing that will be provided subsequent to this meeting. What those draft calculated rates actually look like under our program that we have, what they look like relative to other municipalities surrounding you, and then we'll cap off with some next steps and kind of where we go from here. So just as a bit of a background here, council passed your development charges bylaw on it's February 1st of 2015, effectively imposed development charge rates for all eligible city services. imposed. DC bylaws have a shelf life of 5 years, and they expire, and that particular bylaw expires on February 1st of 2020. So effectively, in order to continue collecting development charges, a new bylaw has to be passed by the city prior to that date. And in order to do that, a background study has to be completed, and a statutory public meeting has to be held. So just as a quick overview in terms of when we're talking about development charges, what am I actually speaking about? They're effectively fees imposed on development to finance what we like to call as growth-related capital costs, effectively to pay for your infrastructure and facilities, to maintain your existing service level. The theory behind it is your growth pays for growth, so that the financial burden of growth-related capital infrastructure costs are not borne by your taxpayers or your ratepayers in your existing community. Just as to be clear, the way development charges are structured, development charges can only pay for new capital costs associated with servicing those developments. DCs cannot be used to pay for general repair and replacement or regular operational costs. Those are outside or excluded from the purview of DCs, and they have to be considered in our calculation methodology. So just as a kind of how does it fit into kind of a pie of municipal revenue streams here and the way development charges fit? Again, the DCs, they fund that portion of your growth-related capital costs, and they fund a significant portion of that. There is a share of, even though costs might be development-related, not all of those costs can be funded by DCs. We have to make appropriate deductions and allocations surrounding each of those projects relative to what the project scope and as well as the nature of them. We hear, a lot about there's the DCs, but then there's also direct developer contributions. So direct developer contributions are new infrastructure, it's related to growth, but those costs itself are actually not included in the development charges calculation. Things such as local water mains, sewer mains, local roads, anything that's related to a specific development and internal to a subdivision are considered to be local service costs and funded directly by the developer. Those specific costs, yes, growth related, but excluded from the calculation of the development charge. And that's very important when we actually look at the DC framework and the calculations that we have put forward. The remaining costs, property taxes, utility rates, by far the largest funding source for a municipality, and again specifically for Clarence Rockland itself. Those fund operating costs, long-term infrastructure repair, maintenance, and replacement costs. Generally all things that kind of outside of the DC regime, and even in addition to that, development charges only fund the initial round capital. Once that capital cost, although it's been funded by the development charges initially, they actually then get shifted to the property tax base and utility rate base for ongoing maintenance and repair and operation. So it's only the DCs fund the initial round capital of those costs. So just to give a bit of an overview here of our study process and how we come to calculating the rates, we start off the process at the beginning with a development forecast looking at the amount, type, and location of development. We'll calculate our 10-year historic service levels. For some of the calculations that are in our development charges background study, we can fund or use development charges to fund services or increase your service level beyond what's been established in the preceding 10 years of the forthcoming planning period. So we can only fund to an average level of service, and that's particularly important when we look at calculating DCs. We then look at our identification of our capital program or growth-related capital costs, what costs are considered to be development-related, and we start off with a growth cost. Those costs are then allocated or distributed between and discounted based on a variety of allocations, whether we have any grants or subsidies, any available DC reserves on hand, any replacement or benefit to existing shares. Those all get netted off or netted down from the total gross cost. After all those deductions or the series deductions are made, we end up with our cost eligible for DC recovery. That's the cost that gets rolled into the development charges calculation. So what's actually eligible for development charge funding in this particular period and what we're going to be recovering for relative to growth. Those costs get distributed between your residential and non-residential sector. Residentially, the charges are set on a per dwelling unit basis. Non-residentially, they're set on a GFA basis, whether it's dollar per square foot or dollar per square meter or gross floor area. So just as in terms of the general overview here, in terms of our stakeholder and council consultation, I guess we just did want to bring up that this is a very formal process, and we do want to make as transparent as possible with council and the development community. So those kind of meetings with the development industry and stakeholders are certainly welcomed. We've already had a kickoff meeting and a meeting with the industry earlier on in the year to go through some of the calculations and the kind of the proposed methodologies. And we certainly intend to continue to meet with them throughout the process that we have. This is again well and above and beyond the statutory requirements under the Development Charges Act. And we obviously recommend a kind of a transparent process like this for both council and stakeholders, so everyone is aware of what costs and what the projects are and what the calculated rates are relative to before the background study is actually tabled and adopted at a bylaw process. So I will get into some of the Bill 108 information now, and I'm not sure how familiar some of those around the table are about it. Effectively, the More Homes and More Choices Act of 2019 is Bill 108. It received royal assent on June 6th of 2019. It was tabled as early as May 2nd of 2019 and went through the legislature quite quickly in terms of from when it got tabled to when it actually received royal assent. That bill proposes changes to several different pieces of legislation, the Development Charges Act and Planning Act being part of those changes under that bill. And the changes to the Development Charges Act and I guess forthcoming DC regulations will certainly have an impact to the city. Some of the key things here are the exemption of secondary suites from development charges in new construction. The development charge rates will be payable at different times, and I have separate slides for each of them, so we'll go through them in a bit more detail. And then your soft service development charges are going to be collected now through a community benefits charges bylaw, and it will be kind of removed from the authority of your Development Charges Act. And there's still a lot of kind of, I guess you can call it unknowns around this process, but it should be clarified by way of regulation in the next couple of months as those get released. So just to go through a few of these key changes for in relation to the bill and what that means and relative to the existing situation. Currently, development charge exemption is applied if a second unit is created only in an existing dwelling unit. Development charges are charged if that second unit is declared at the building permit application. Effectively, under the bill and under the new passage, secondary suites will be in the units would be exempt from DCs at the onset of your permit application. So it's a bit different. They used to be exempt only in existing dwelling units. Now, at the time of building permit application, you can declare your secondary suite and you would be exempt from the payment of DCs.
English is my second language. You're speaking so fast. I'm having difficulty following you. So could you just slow down a little bit?
Sure.
I appreciate it.
No problem.
And speak louder.
Okay. I'll slow it down and louder. So there will be certain restrictions and details of the eligible eligible classes of residential buildings will be set out by way of regulation. Again, that will be forthcoming in the summer months, and hopefully throughout the fall we will receive that information. Secondly, there's the timing of payment. And this is a fairly big change under the DC Act. So currently, development charges are paid for at the time of first building permit, which is subject to any agreements that are already existing. What's proposed is that your commercial, industrial, institutional, and rental housing developments shall pay your DCs in equal payments over a 6-year period. Nonprofit housing, there's a change to that, and you can actually pay your DCs for nonprofit housing over a 21-year annual period. So it's quite an extended amount of time for which development charges can be paid, and particularly, again, for those nonprofit type dwelling units, but also for those in your industrial, commercial, and institutional sectors will now have a 6-year payment plan for that. And the way the legislation is written, at this particular time, unless it's changed by way of regulation, it does mention shall, which is a very key component in the world of law, because unless you have an agreement that states otherwise, that means you have to abide by the 6-year annual payment and 21-year annual payment. So, and the other important component to that is that the payments are going to start at the time of occupancy, which is a bit different than the time of building permit. So for some municipalities that don't actually track the occupancy side of things, municipalities will have to start doing that in order to fulfill the requirements of this legislation. The payments themselves, they cannot be indexed, but a municipality may charge interest on those payments over that period of time. The prescribed rate will be identified by way of regulation as well.
The prescribed rate will be identified.
Contractors could go bankrupt before the 6 years is over. You may have to agree for the water, 3 years of money.
Through the mayor, that's a very good question, and it's ones that we've raised as well, and we're going to continue to raise through the consultation period. We don't know how that'll actually be enforced, whether it's, because also units change hands, and it can go through different occupancies, whether it's kind of left to discretion at the treasurer and it gets added to the tax roll at the end. If you put a credit on it, or you put a lien on it or on the property, there's other ways you can do it, but it gets very convoluted in a very legal manner, which will obviously increase the administrative burden on the municipality. We have, so there's going to be the consultations, and municipalities are all likely going to be consulted on it, and those are the things that we encourage yourselves, and we will certainly do the same on our municipal clients' behalf.
And we would cover the cost of trying to recover the money if they close before 6 years.
Through the mayor, it'd be, at this point in time, it's going to be difficult to do that. I'm sure there's going to be a mechanism that would have to be in place in order to ensure that doesn't occur.
Could we ask a letter of the bank, or the CALDA, the letter of a warranty of payment?
Well, through a letter of credit process,
Yeah.
to me, then that'd be the opposite of giving a 6-year payment plan, because then they would have to have all the entire funds up front, which would then, it would kind of defeat the purpose of paying it over that 6-year or 21-year time period, because your funds would have to be available.
Questions that the government hasn't thought of, questions we have to ask to make sure that it's clarified somewhere.
That's right.
We don't get caught in this.
That's right.
Or that we automatically, once we sign the agreement, that we have a lien on the property as a guarantee.
The property's sold to somebody else.
That way, there is already a lien on it, it cannot get sold unless we told on the land.
So it wouldn't be applied to residential type dwelling units unless it's nonprofit or rental. So at general single-family detached homes, the payment plan wouldn't apply. It would still be at the time of building permit. Only for your industrial, commercial, institutional, rental housing, and nonprofit housing.
But it's something that would need to be clarified, because we have to have some protection.
Absolutely. Yep.
For us, for the city, we're used to getting that amount up front, no matter what. So that means now the amounts get spread over 6 years, which is going to hurt us when we do cash flow management for our DC charge account, when we do projects and stuff. After 6 years, when everything is rolling, and then it'll be back to normal-ish, but the first 6 years is going to be tough on small municipalities.
Different safety.
Through the mayor, that's an excellent point, and something that we again raised through our initial letters to the province, and that's something that we may need to consider to build in through this process once we get a bit more information into the actual calculation of the rates, because it will impact your ability. Once the funds come in, it'll be spread over a much longer period of time, and that means your funds aren't available to carry out the projects which you're anticipating at that particular time.
Did you get any answers from the province?
What do you think?
Well, Doug's on the
That's right.
Must be something that's catchy.
So the third point here is when the development charge rates are determined. And then again, this is a bit different than when it's actually payable. So development charges payable are generally determined at the issuance of your first building permit. At this particular time, development charge amounts would actually be frozen on the date of your application as it relates to your site plan control or your zoning or your rezoning application. So if none of those applications exist through this process, it would continue to remain payable, and the rate will be determined at the time of your building permit. So, for example,
So again, that's another cash flow issue, because when we build like fire stations or whatever, we build it over the 10, 15-year period at a certain cost. Now, we're not even going to be getting that amount because.
yes. Yep. Yeah, so effectively, if you have a rezoning application today, that rate that's currently enforced at this particular time would be enforced when they actually pull their permit, in, let's just say, a year from now. So we're going through this process, and the DCs potentially have the opportunity to increase. The developer would pay the rate that was enforced now prior to the increase being implemented in future time. So it does give the development community a sense of predictability in terms of their pro formas when they go through the development process. On the converse, on the municipality side, they are collecting revenues at different time points at a lower rate. And then again, to the councilor's comment, it will create again kind of a cash flow issue in terms of when the collections are made. We don't know particularly at this particular time if there's going to be a regulation around prescribing a maximum time period between your site plan or rezoning application to when you can actually pull a permit, to avoid that you have a rezoning application in now, and 10 years from now you pull a development charge permit, or a building permit, and paying your DCs at the rate it was enforced 5 to 10 years ago. So we would hope that there's again some time period that we would put in by way of regulation to enforce that.
Yeah, because some companies will come and then wait 3-4 years before they do anything, and then for the end of the 6 years, we had a rate that would be like,
Yes, and which we agree is just fundamentally not correct. The capacity that's at the time in 6 years from now is much different than the servicing capacity that's available at the time of the application. So that's certainly a concern, and there is, to acknowledge the province, there's in the explanatory notes some allusion to the fact that this might come to fruition, but we don't have any particulars at this particular time. And hopefully, again, by way of regulation is clarified. So just in terms of some services that were previously eligible for recovery. So what we have here is a table that looks at just 2 columns, the 100% cost recovery services, ranging from your protection services, services related to a highway, engineered services, and transit services. On the right side is your 90% cost recovery services. Effectively, there's discounted services under the Development Charges Act, which you cannot fund 100% of the cost for. There is a statutory 10% discount that has to be funded from your tax base. And those are all the ones in that column, from library, parks and recreation, land ambulance. Those are all considered to be your discounted services. As of kind of prior to Bill 108, this is the regime in terms of the way development charges were collected for. What the movement to now under Bill 108, there's going to be a shift in what's actually services that are eligible for recovery. So what that means is that only those hard services, those 100% eligible cost recoveries of protection services and your engineered services will remain under the Development Charges Act authority. With that said, waste diversion and land ambulance, which are in the right column of 90% eligible services, will now move into the 100% eligible service category and remain under the authority of the Development Charges Act. The remaining service categories, your soft services, are being entirely removed from the Development Charges Act framework. So what that means is going to be a new authority proposed under the Planning Act, which would allow for municipalities to fund library services, parks and recreation, under a community benefits charges bylaw. And that community benefits charges essentially now becomes that vehicle to fund your soft service development charges component.
So everything that is put aside right now would move into that special.
All the service categories that are 90% would move into a new community benefits charges bylaw. So they'd be removed from the Development Charges Act.
So how would the city actually go ahead by collecting that soft service, whatever it is that?
Got that on the next slide. So what that does now, so I guess a couple things. So your community benefits charges is imposed by bylaw. It's going to be your new Section 37 under the Planning Act. And again, that CBC, it replaces your soft service development charges, the old Section 37 contributions, so any density bonusing negotiations that were allowed for, and your Section 42 parkland dedication. So you can't ask for parkland dedication and impose a community benefits charges bylaw. It can only be one or the other. So everything is rolled now into one charge. That charge specifically is going to be levied on the basis of the land value of that development site. So there's going to be a prescribed land value percentage, which would be applied to those sites, and that revenue collected from the land value of that site would be used to fund your soft service component, which we're under the Development Charge Act regime now under your community benefits charges.
So, I know this is new for everyone, but has someone figured out, financially speaking, if we're going to be, if we're going to have a second way of getting funding through, are we going to end up overall with the same pot of money, or we're going to go less? I think we're going to go less.
It's a very convoluted answer.
I
I
know.
apologize. So,
Because well, it's covered at 90%. I
apologize.
So are we able to, with what we see in the law, going to be able to get that 90% from the other scenario?
so through the mayor, two things. The actual percentage of the land value has not been set yet. So that'll be released by way of regulation. So we actually don't know what the land percentage value is, and whether that land value percentage is applied uniformly across all Ontario municipalities, which inherently is just inequitable, or if there's going to be changes in terms of specific areas. The second component to that answer is that we don't know if it will be revenue neutral or not until we get the land value percentage. The minister has clarified in his letter that his intention with this change is that municipalities do not raise less revenues under the community benefits charges bylaw than it would have under the Development Charges Act. So his letter maintains a revenue neutral situation. To be truthful, until we run the sensitivity analysis in terms of what revenue would be collected from the land value perspective under the new regime, I can't say that with certainty until I see that. But we can only rely on the minister's comments relating to a revenue neutral situation.
You gotta be ready for us by 2020 when we come along, when our act finishes.
So we're going to get into that. Effectively, it does not change for you, and that's a good segue into the next slide here. I guess the only thing I'd just like to cap off on this is that, unlike the Development Charges Act, the actual process itself, there's a strategy that has to be done similar. I would imagine it's going to be similar to a DC background study, but probably not as lengthy and formal as what we have. There's no appeal process or right to appeal under a CBC bylaw, at least at this particular time. Any public process isn't mandatory, although the legislation or the bill certainly suggests that it would be kind of welcomed and promoted that way, but it's not mandated like the DCs. So in terms of the transition provisions and how this actually affects your bylaw, which is going to be expiring, and the process that we're actually going through, effectively there's two options for council. The first one is you can continue collecting, and you have the authority to continue collect for your discounted services as per your existing bylaw. So the DC soft services that are currently in place, you have the authority to continue collecting for them up until the prescribed date that the minister will set out by way of regulation. So for example, and hypothetically speaking, January 1st of 2021 is the prescribed date. At that particular point in time, you would have to have a new community benefits charge bylaw in place, or earlier that, but at that particular time, you have to have a CBC in, and your DCs would no longer be able to be charged on January 2nd of 2021. So there will be a date, and you have to comply to that date. We don't know when that transition or how long it might be. I suspect it would be at least a year, but I don't know.
Depending on the calculations you come up with, are we really revenue neutral or not, we may or may not be in a hurry to do this second phase of with the soft services as well.
That's a good point, yeah. It depends on like, we would have to, hopefully through the consultation sessions and through our input, and as well as the municipalities, that we do come up with a methodology whether that we deem revenue neutral, and I guess that is still the overarching intent by the regulation. Yeah. The second option that is available for council is to calculate new rates for your discounted services and complete the background information required to support them. So you still have the authority to pass a new development charges bylaw with the soft service component. Although Bill 108 has received royal assent, you have the authority to still pass a new bylaw with potentially higher rates, and those would only again be enforced no matter what up until the prescribed date, whenever that may be. So there's two options from council at this particular time. The rates, or the draft rates that we are going to show you today, effectively rely on option one, which is keeping the existing rates under your soft services bylaw in place, and we've calculated new development charges for all the remaining service categories. And that could be a matter of question afterwards, and we can look at
Keep everything the way it is now, for the next, but we're gonna have to change it eventually, so why don't we do it right away?
the soft service rates only are being kept the same. The hard services of water, sewer, roads, the bulk of your
The
development charges
100%, yeah.
are going to be, the 100% ones are recalculated.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a transition and a hybrid between both.
But the application would need to be done eventually anyway, even when it goes to a separate, to the CBC bylaw.
It would then, no, you don't have to redo your hard services. Those will remain intact.
No, the hard.
But your
services-
general services, your
Yeah.
soft services, would just be removed from the DC Act authority, and you wouldn't collect them on a per unit basis anymore. They'd be collected under the new
But
authority.
then the rate can change when we change it into, when we remove them from the DCs.
Well, it'd be a completely different
Yeah.
methodology. It'd be based on land value. So it would have no relation to the work that we're doing now.
That's true, okay.
So it would have no relation to the work that we're doing now.
So that's the Bill 108 overview, and we'll get into some of the specifics of the actual calculation of the rates as it relates to the development charges that we have done. So the development forecast, it's effectively on a 10-year planning period from 2019 through to 2028. It's a 10-year planning period, and the information, again, provided in consultation with city staff and the planning department, and also relative to some of the forecast work that the city has already done. So just to give a bit of an overview of the forecast and what we're looking at, we have an increase, I guess, over the 10-year planning period of about 1,900 dwelling units, moving to about 11,500 dwelling units by the planning period in 2028. Your census population with that increase of 1,900 dwelling units relates to about 4,300 census population increase. So you're close to about 30,000 people in the city by 2028. What you have under that 4,300 is your population in new dwelling units. That's a very specific calculation for the purposes of calculating a development charge, looking at the people residing only in those new dwelling units. And again, very specific to DCs and not really a relation to any other official planning documents that you may have seen. On the non-residential side, we're looking at employment growth of about 600 new employees over that 10-year period. So by the end of the planning period, looking at about 5,900 employees in total. For the purposes of calculating DC, we look at non-residential building space as a proxy for the determination of the rate. So about 30,500 square meters of new non-residential development or non-residential gross floor area will be constructed or anticipated to be constructed over that period. And that translates your employment forecast to a GFA forecast.
The next 10 years you're forecasting, in order for this calculations to work, you're calculating 190 residential units per year.
Correct.
Currently, we're at 175 under current DC. We're not even meeting that 175 currently. We've met it once, maybe twice in the past 4 to 5 years. The only time that we've met that was, I think it was 2011 or 2012, or something like that, where we had it was a year or two that was really big growth. But then the council at that time was raising taxes at the rate of 11 to 12% a year. Basically killed everything. So now, in order for the calculation to work, at the numbers we'll look in a few slides, you need to have that 190.
Explanation.
If you don't have that 190 per year, it means we're underfunding the DC.
So
It's a 10-year average.
it's a 10-year average. Yeah, and also the way it's
And on the 10-year, I'm pretty sure we have the 175.
Avec ton montant de 2011-2012 qui était à...
C'est pour ça qu'on le figure sur 10 ans.
Yes, but the average is there at 175. You have even 195 here. All right.
Yeah, but last year we thought it was going to be a big year too, but then when we had the adjusted numbers,
That's why they go over 10
it was,
years, right?
it was below 175.
Yeah, but that's why you go over 10 years. Some years you'll do good, some years you'll go.
Well, all I'm saying is that the last good year we had was almost 10 years ago.
But we still, like I said, we still, we figure it out in 10 years, and on the 10-year one, we have the average. We have the proper number. That's why you gotta keep it to 10 years.
I'm not questioning the 10, you're using the 10-year average. It's what the industry does when it does the development charge. All I'm saying is, it only works when you have all the variables working for you. True. We don't. We have a friggin' highway that's a parking lot.
We're going off topic right
No, it's all part of how to calculate how much the DCs would need to go up. Anyways,
now. I'll explain it to you.
I guess just my only comment on the actual forecast itself is that the 1900s also, it's 19, it is on an average basis, but on the 5-year point of the bylaw, or the actual bylaw is enforced, we have used a slightly lower number than that, so that during a cash flow perspective, it is closer to the 175 and 180, and then kind of brought up gradually after that. So we are looking at an annualized or an average basis, yes. From a cash flow perspective, and timing perspective, we are using those numbers closer to the first 2019 through 2024, a lower number than that. And just kind of with that said, I think it's important also to look at kind of the development forecast and the trends. We have the 3 lines here. Our blue line is our census population, our red line is our occupied household growth, and our green line is our place of work employment. Effectively, we're looking at just continuing along the trend line in terms of what we've been doing and where we're going over that period. So we are looking at kind of a very similar type growth in population, households, and employment as what we've seen in the average over that preceding period from back from 2006.
Many residents are becoming the place of employment because we have more and more people working from home too. So that will, I don't know where you're going to do the calculation for those, where you can keep it out. But there's more, like the government is encouraging, both government, provincial and federal, encouraging people to work from home.
So that's a very good and very technical question, actually. So work at home employment is actually not included in the employment forecast. It's included in the residential forecast. Because the work at home employment doesn't generate any new or net new additional square footage, as it's all part of the residential forecast. So it's actually taken out of our 600 employees that we're showing there. So it's actually taken out of our 600 employees that we're showing. So just in terms of our maximum permissible funding envelope, so as I mentioned, there's the historic service level calculations that we need to be cognizant of. They are kind of required for some of the services that we are needed under the Development Charges Act, and we have to be in line with that 2009 to 2018 historic service level, calculated by multiplying the 10-year historic service level with the growth that we're planning. It establishes effectively a development charges ceiling. And for many of the service categories, we can't exceed that development charges ceiling as it relates to areas such as fire protection services or public works. We have a ceiling that we can't do, and it can't exceed that 10-year historic average. So just in terms of our development-related capital programs, they've been compiled in consultation with city staff and input from various engineering firms. The city retained 2 separate engineering firms to provide input to the roads and related capital program and the needs required around them, as well as the water and sewer servicing requirements around it for those. So all the costs related to the hard services here are kind of derivative of those engineering works that identify the needs in the municipality and when those services are required to service new development. Those capital costs, where Hempstead has come in, is identified those costs, and we've helped establish and adjust those capital costs in accordance with the development charges legislation. Again, so any grant subsidies, other recoveries, whether it be from developers, are all incorporated and netted off the net DC cost. Any replacement or benefit to existing shares, so shares of the project, which are replacing an existing asset or benefiting the existing development are excluded from DC recovery. 10% statutory discount, although for the purposes of this, in light of Bill 108, doesn't really come into effect anymore, but certainly for any services, if you were to recover for them, it would be. Any available DC reserve funds and any shares of project that benefit development beyond the 10-year planning period. And that's, again, particularly important for your engineering program because a lot of the works are being done or needed now to accommodate some of the development that's occurring here, but also a lot of it is going to be required to service development outside of the 10-year planning period, which the DC Act or our window is looking at. Although they're still considered to be DC eligible, which is not included for in this calculation at this particular time. So with that said, we have a citywide kind of gross program cost here of $102.4 million. And that relates to the service categories of fire, roads and related, public works, waterworks, and sewer works. Again, these are the service categories as they relate to kind of the post-Bill 108 changes and only your hard services to which we're calculating in DC for at this particular time. A couple things I want to point out here in relation to this graph. So again, this is the total gross program cost. Total cost that's required to in place infrastructure required on not only to service the development in this 10-year period, but also development for on the water and sewer side and even the road side to a longer term planning horizon out to 2041. So a much longer planning horizon there. The bars at the top, your blue ones on the slide there, those are relate to your DC collection slide. So of the $102.4 million gross program, $30 million or $30.8 million is related to the DC collections in this 10-year planning period. So we're only covering about 30% of those costs, of the gross costs, are actually allocated and considered to be development charge eligible or development charge recoverable in this planning period. The second very important bar there is your purple bar, which is your post-period DC collections. So there's going to be a significant share of the program, about $41 million, that we're considered to be still development charge eligible and development charge recoverable. Although it's not benefiting the development in this particular planning period, it's going to be considered for recovery in the next planning period and subsequent DC studies. So it can be collected for, although it's not including the calculation of the charges at this particular time. Other components in here relate to grants, subsidies, and developer contributions, which come in to offset the cost of the program. Your tax and rate supported share, which would be a share of the program that would be required, or kind of a co-funding contribution from your tax base or utility rates in order to carry out the program, again, over the longer term. And then any available DC reserves that are on hand for which development has already occurred and you've collected funds for are applied towards that program itself. The details of all the projects, again, will be provided subsequently by city staff. So taking that into consideration here, the calculated maximum rate that we've identified is $20,000, or just closer to $21,000 here for a single and semi-detached unit. So the table here looks at the charges differentiated by dwelling unit type, and the pie graph looks at what service categories are being funded from development charges with that $20,981 for a single and semi-detached unit. So, again, this is a bit more complex because you are looking at a bit of a hybrid approach here with Bill 108. So we're looking at the new service categories of which we've calculated a rate for: fire, public works, roads, water, and sewer. And those are all identified in that bar graph or pie graph. We also have the service categories of your general services, which represent the service categories for which they're currently existing in your existing bylaw, but they're brought forward in the calculation at this particular time as a transfer under the transition measures under Bill 108. 75% of the total cost or total development charge that's calculated here is really related to your hard services, your engineered services. Next question might be, how does that rate compare to the rates that are currently in force?
I thought more of my next question was going to say, but I got to be finished soon because we got a council meeting to be finished here.
Okay, so I can make it quicker.
Thank you.
I was told to talk slow. Should I speed up now? I don't know.
Speed us.
Cut the material, but don't go faster.
Okay, sorry, there is a lot of material, I apologize. Okay, so in terms of the current rates that are relative to the calculated
So,
rates,
in terms
the
of the
current
current
rates for a total urban charge unit that's receiving water and sewer services is just over $16,000. With the rates that we've calculated, we're at just closer to $21,000, so representing a 31% increase on the total quantum of the total payable charge at the end with an urban service unit. Two components that I'd like to bring to the attention. Your first column there is labeled discounted services. Again, those are all the services that are affected by Bill 108. The position at this particular time is that the rates have not been calculated a new rate has not been calculated, and those rates that are currently in force under your existing bylaw are transitioned and maintained. So there's no change in the rate for those four service categories from the current rates to what we calculate. The other categories we have calculated a rate for relative to the capital programs that we have. The largest share of the rate increase is really being driven by the water service category and your roads category. There is treatment plant works that are included in the capital program, which is driving the increased costs and increased development charges associated with your waterworks category. The roads program, again, is going up by about 40% in particular, and that's related to road work and all the other works, and whether it's path works or sidewalks that are included in the capital program. But on a quantum level, total quantum of the charge, it's again 31% of an increase on that rate, closer to $5,000 on the total development charge for a single detached unit. So those costs don't include, I guess, two specific service areas of Bourget and Clarence Creek. There is, I guess, from the engineers, they've identified if they wanted to service those two particular areas. The servicing cost would be quite substantial, respectively $36 million and $18 million for those two areas. Just by way of the gross cost itself of servicing them, not all of those costs are considered to be development charge eligible. There is a significant benefit to the existing community, which would then hook into that rate or hook into that system, which would then have the benefit of now sewer servicing. So those costs are all netted off the capital program, which relates to, as a very draft level and just for an order of magnitude, a pretty significant charge in terms of development charges for those who would connect in or building a unit in those communities receiving sanitary sewer services. In order to recover the balance of the cost from those existing units, the city would likely have to look into calculating a municipal act charge under section 391, which would be for existing units wanting to connect in to the municipal servicing to recover the balance or those share of the cost.
They almost be applying for a second mortgage.
Right, yeah, and there, again, they would be obviously a very high magnitude as well. But that's, again, probably something that's outside the scope of the DC, but I guess probably giving you at least some insight as to what would have to be done if you were to proceed along that route.
But that would be covered with the DC coming from everywhere in the city.
This would be applied only to specifically those service areas. It's a very localized piece of infrastructure.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but the DCs that would be perceived would be taken from any houses that is being built.
No, this would be applied specifically on that specific
So
area.
why would only the people from Clarence Creek and Bourget pay for that when they've been paying all those years to maintain the sewer system and without with the DC charges?
The sewer system in Rockland is paid by the users of Rockland.
No, but the DC charges paid for the grill, for example, and they paid, and the people who built houses in Bourget and Clarence Creek did pay development charges to cover that cost. So why all of a sudden, because there would be development in those areas, only those people have to pay for it? That's not fair.
Now, for example, in Rockland, there's a 2% CIY charge that's imposed, and then there's water and sewer charges if there's a property that has access to water and sewer, but there's a greater portion of a tax burden that's imposed on a given property for the sewer, then development charges will not be paid for those residents. And these funds are self-sustaining, really. And if you don't have access to those services, then you don't pay for those services, simply. So as Mrs. Chouanière has stated, the money's taken out of the reserve fund. But those rates had been paid by those who had used the actual services they had requested or they had been serviced for.
So so the only other component to kind of cap off the residential sector is a comparison of these rates relative to some other jurisdictions around you. Relatively speaking, the city of Ottawa, whether it's a rural service charge or a non-urban service area, those charges are significantly higher than even the calculated rates that we had in Clarence Rockland, respectively, kind of just low now, upper, kind of higher than Russell Township of that. Just have to keep in mind when we are doing comparison, these are just looking strictly at the development charge rates themselves. The infrastructure requirements, each of the communities are different, and that's really the key driver here, what the costs are and the growth of each community. So we have to take that into consideration, but we do want to put this up for you just to kind of show that comparison, but the infrastructure needs was primary here.
Do we have any idea what Alfred Deschanel is doing with area-specific DC charge? Does anyone know what that is?
It's just related to the water and sewer service. So just to compare the unurban service charges, it's just the water and sewer.
I don't think they have a DC charger. Do they have DC chargers?
They have DC charges.
Okay, Champlain doesn't have it.
Yeah.
I asked the question because the major part of development charges that are paid are not the same for the Clarence area. What was it for them? Well,
Your non-industrial sector or commercial users and industrial users would be $123.34 per square meter. And again, most of the charge here is really largely all related to your hard services of roads, water, and sewer. Similarly to residential, it would represent a similar type increase in around 30-some-odd% from the current charges that are currently in place. Sorry, I'm kind of moving a little quicker now, but
So, even for the water charge, and maybe Julien is best to answer that one, I don't know. We're still at least 4 to 5 years away from the major investments we want to do with the network in Rockland, which affects with our contract with Nation. So even though that is still technically one development charge study away, we're still looking at that big of an investment right away in getting it through the DC charge with this round.
correct. Recognizing that the entire cost of that infrastructure work isn't being funded in this planning period, there's a large share of that project that's going to be funded through subsequent DC studies. So it's apportioned out between the planning period that's benefiting this planning period and what's going to benefit in future DC studies.
It's just that, we're not going to do anything for, let's say, 4 years, 5 years.
Yeah.
It's like when we built the fire stations, we're not starting to pay until 2020. It was still part of it was this development charge that we're currently under, but now we're still one charge away, let's say, and we're going to start right now collecting. So just trying to look at ways to have that charge be not as big of a burden on developers for the next round, but.
So just in terms of some next steps here in terms of cap it off, we're looking to hold our industry consultation sessions throughout the month of July and August, with probably a report back to council in terms of how that all went and what transpired from that, subject to staff discussion. The background study itself would be drafted throughout August and September, made public shortly after that, with the intention to hold a public meeting sometime in the fall. And with the bylaw being passed subsequent to that, in advance of the February 1st deadline, but hopefully kind of before the year end of 2019.
Question pour M. Mirabel?
any questions?
Question pour M. Mirabel?
Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you very much.
Apologize for the length, Your
For the length.
Mr. Mayor.
That's right, yeah. That's right.
Fine. Well, thank you then. So that clears up the development charges matter, doesn't it? Yes, it does. This is the list that the gentleman alluded to, that Mr. Mirabella alluded to at the very, very beginning of his presentation. There you go. All right. Let's go on to notice of motion. Mr. Zant. Item 6.1, I believe, or 6.2? 6.2, fine. Notice of motion. Let's go on, gentlemen and ladies. Did we take care of item 6.1 already? Yes, we did. All right, then. Councillor Zant, could you please read item 6.2, your notice of motion? We're all ears. 6.2. Be it resolved that Council mandates the administration to review the policies and bylaws pertaining to containers in order to consider the possibility of allowing containers in commercial areas with the condition that they be located in a discrete location and that some measures be established in order to avoid them from being an eyesore. Can I speak to this notice of motion? We don't need someone to second this. Well, Mr. Bouchard did second it in any event. Well, go ahead. At present, there are big metallic containers, you know, that are illegally stored in an urban zoned area. And at present, many businesses do have those containers, and they don't have any permit with that in that regard. And I, along with other members of council, asking them to withdraw those containers would be tantamount to a direct attack to merchants. If, for example, and I'd like to give an example, and I don't know, maybe Mr. Leonard will take care of this particular part. For example, Canadian Tire has 2 containers of the type I'm referring to parked in their store area, but they're hidden, of course. They're in the what I call the garden part. It's no problem. The Chamberlain Garage, I'll name them, it's a fact. They have 2 containers in the parking lot area in full sight of Laurier Street residents. Now, I might like to believe that in similar type situations that the department might say, okay, they have the right to keep those containers, but let them build a fence around those containers to hide them from people's eyesight, or view, should I say. You know, there are many other businesses that wish to have their containers because they're too small, they can't expand it. That will enable them to obtain those containers. And even we also have a container, and that is a good point, Mr. Simard. Even the town of had a big white container at the back of the town hall that was against the wall, the bylaw, and the Jean-Marc Lalonde Arena also had a container that was illegal that was there. That's why I'm asking the administration to take a further look at enacted policies so that we don't hinder the merchants here, and that we don't contribute to pollution here. I'm entirely in agreement here, Mr. Mayor. It's easy also to make a container look more presentable. If we take a look at chip wagons, and we have sheds that are built besides chip wagons, and they're really eyesores, those are. Even then, there's a certain garage in Clarence Creek that doesn't look as good as a container might, and that's not your fault because you're not the owner, but you understand what I'm getting at. Well, that's what I'm saying, you know. Look, as long as some businesses have you know, containers to put their trash in, some containers are an eyesore, others are not. So I just want to, Mrs. Chouanière, according to me, that's the same rule applies to all businesses. If you deal with Tim Hortons, schools are there at the back of the schools. They need to be fenced in, you know, those particular containers. And there are 2 doors that might swing open to have the garbage trucks come in and take off the garbage or trash or refuse from those containers. But Mr. Zant alludes to those parts that are a bit more visual, that are more in line of sight, if you wish. Now, if it's not seen from people walking along the street or driving along the street or a main street, not necessarily Laurier Street, but just a main street, that's fine. That's what I'm proposing, is that these containers be fenced in to block them from view. Are we giving a directive to town administration? Yes, we give a directive to town administration to commission a study to that effect. And that will be voted at the next meeting of council. 6.3, Mr. Bouchard. Whereas
was completed on Marquette Street, and whereas most culverts belonging to residents were replaced during this project, except for the residents of 4 and 6 Marquette Street. Be it resolved that council authorizes the cost of the culvert to be reimbursed, more specifically on the amount of $400 to Danielle and Brent Goyette, residents of 4 Marquette Street, and an equal amount of $400 to Lise and Laurier Cadieux, residents of 6 Marquette Street.
seconded by Councillor Cardarelli. I can tell you, and I obtained information to this effect. Oh, good. So just keep on adding, eating your salad if you wish to. That's fine. Well, item 4 and 6, it's fine also with the last bit resolved. At one point, it's marked off as 4.5, and at another, well, in English, I have 4 and 5. I'm sorry. So go ahead. So essentially what happened was that before enacting or having a bylaw with regards to the culverts, the placement of culverts, when this La Salle Vaudreuil Street project, all of this work had been completed with regards to the reconstruction of the street, and more than 90% or 80% of the culverts were replaced, and the municipality paid for those and not the users. Now there's a property or 2 properties had their ditches filled through this work, and there's no way for the municipality to have conducted an inspection to determine whether culverts had needed to be replaced or not. Now this year, folks that replaced their asphalt around that area noticed that their culverts needed to be replaced also. So what the residents then ask is that well, they were victims of an injustice with regards to that. Why was it that in 2017, prior to the bylaw being enacted with regards to the replacement of culverts, why 80% of folks got new culverts and they didn't? All they're asking is to recoup the cost of pipes, $400. Those 2 residents are willing to pay for the cost of the work involved, but they'll, all of the work, all the connections, all of the permits will be taken care of by those residents. They're asking to pay for the cost of the pipe. I believe that's minimal, considering that other residents had nothing to pay for, nothing was replaced. So I believe that the request stemming from both residents there is not all that much, considering that this situation occurred prior to the bylaw being enacted. I imagine that it was not a major matter to pay them $400 for the replacement of the piping. Mr. Lalonde, we encountered the same situation when we tackled Forest Hill and Blue Jay, and the answer that we got from the department then was this: if the culvert had been inspected and cleaned by the municipality, if there are things inside that culvert, if they don't need to change the elevation or the grade, they don't change it. Well, those ditches were covered. They could not be inspected at that time. You see, because the ditch had been filled up on both sides, the town could not inspect that area. People were informed that if we had to conduct inspections, we had to remove culverts on both sides, but we would not replace them. That was agreement we arrived at when we filled in the ditches. The level was okay, and they refused to have those culverts being replaced. That was their problem. I don't see why the City of Clarence and Rockland would be called upon to replace for those culverts when they refused us to remove the earth on both sides at that time. It would have been their responsibility at that time to replace those culverts. Yes. The same thing occurred with regards to 6 residences a few years ago. We noticed that older culverts made out of metal had not been replaced because they were the proper grading and at the proper level. But as years went by, those culverts caved in. They had to pay for them, you see, and the new bylaw called for that. And now we're faced with a situation that's basically after the fact. we're creating a precedent. Those are exceptions that we did not offer in the past. I don't see why we would offer exceptions or enter into an exemption at this point in time. The ideal would be to implement a program that would involve villages as well as within the confines of Clarence and Rockland to reduce costs, to maintain ditches, to incite or encourage people to close out their ditches, and that the city of Clarence and Rockland might give out a certain amount or purchase culverts because we obtain much better prices than individuals. Well, we had, I believe that Mr. Darch had come up with a type of fund. Yes, yes. That was to be tapped in for emergency type situations. And council voted. Well, we were the very last municipality that paid for culverts, and you'll remember that on county roads, the counties, United Counties of Prescott Russell did not pay for this, and people were wondering, why is it that you're not paying for guys on the other side of the street, and why are you not paying for us? So if we get involved into this, basically this can of worms, we'll be facing dire consequences. So what are we going to do then? Well, this was a notice of motion. We'll be revisiting this issue at the next meeting. Fine, and we'll vote on it then. Let's go on to question period. Are there any individuals that have any question period? Are there any questions of town council? No, then. That's fine. Thank you. No questions. Report for the United Counties of Prescott and Russell. Well, we're going to be having a presentation for a plan that was presented to us at Quebec City, and I asked Mr. Philip Cormier, and Ellen will be attending at that point in time. This is a plan that requires some municipalities to heat up waste products. The counties ask that this presentation be made to them, and it's, you see, we're talking about a product, an end product from this heated waste that can be resold. We received a bit of information at the conference that we attended, but during the course of the presentation we'll be receiving a bit more detail as to what kind of costs are involved in all of this. If there's a tipping fee, for example, we're about the only municipality, I believe, that has a scale, or a balance, should I say, or a scale that will weigh the trash contents. So the counties will start picking up garbage, and well, we'll see what happens next week. Without increasing the rate they're called upon to pay. Well, that's right. Let's go on now to item 9.1, tax arrears status. Mr. Levert, you haven't spoken up in a long time. As further to the tax sale, which was executed on April the 6th, Mr. Mayor, 2 properties remain unsold. The Committee of the Whole recommends that Council authorizes the administration to pursue with options 1A and B as outlined in report number FIN 2019-017, which would allow the properties to be advertised on a longer period with a real estate agency. Questions, Mr. Levert? Let's say that in one of the options that called for the acquisition of the properties, did we proceed with a study concerning property in Clarence as to what we could do with this property? Did we think about those options that we might adopt with regards to the use that those properties could be put to? No. The potential use of those properties has not been looked into. Of course, if we take possession of those properties, we'll be called upon to destroy those buildings, are we not? Or to put them down. Well, what's mentioned in the report is that there's a risk of the properties being condemned if they are not acquired. Now, from a municipal standpoint, we have to proceed to a study to determine whether these properties can be deemed to be condemned or not. Even if they're not condemned, they fall under our jurisdiction, our charge, if you wish, from a legal perspective. Now, there are other options open to us, I believe. If ever we sell a site that is contaminated, we could offset the selling price with the price it would cost to decontaminate it. Well, yes, that's of course if we sell off this property. But the question that is before council is the following. Especially in Clarence Creek, for example, would it be a good idea to proceed environmental soil testing to determine what we have to deal with with regards to that unsold property? Of course, Mr. Mayor, the actual owner had already performed the soil tests 10 or so years ago. Yes, because the reservoir had been replaced or had been changed. But maybe we might take a look at the results of that particular study. They must have a record of inspection somewhere. Well, no one will proceed with the purchase of that property without knowing the past history of the sale, without knowing what the past history of that property up for sale is. Well, we have nothing to lose by putting it up for sale through a real estate agency. Let's take a look at the study that was commissioned many years ago and look at the conclusions and determine if they're still valid today as they had been 10 years ago. Well, we're left with about a 2-year period, really, to decide either to resell or sell off the property or not. If things don't work out, then at that time, there's still the possibility left to us to reacquire the property or to restart the process anew. If we're talking about a 1-year period, within a 1-year period, there's nothing much that can be done with this property. Let's see what can be done with regards to selling it off, but we are still at this point in time facing a 2-year leeway to determine whether or not the property can be sold off. Yes, but we're still stuck with this property for at least for a 1-year period to determine whether we can keep it or selling it off. To rezone it would cost about $25,000 to $30,000, and you're up to $115,000 with total attached costs with regards to that property. We might try to acquire it initially and see what kind of expenditures involved. If I recall, not too long ago, we discussed about some properties that the municipality could get rid of to avoid, having properties administered uselessly. Why would we acquire other properties at this point in time? If those properties are not conducive to create something big from a municipal standpoint, a big project, for example, that doesn't amount to anything to purchase it. Well, if we're talking about $20,000 or $25,000 to acquire this property, that cost us $80,000 in lost taxes. It might be nearly impossible to sell this small property, Clarence Creek, for $115,000. Well, if you're saying that we could acquire it, we would acquire it to compensate for tax arrears? Is that what you're saying? Well, the acquisition process does not necessarily call for this. Now, this property, well, there's $90,000 still owed on this property as things stand right now. If we are to assess it, and if it's condemned, it might impact the sale price. We're not in a position right now to determine whether we're going to sell it at a loss or at a profit. But the taxes owed, will play a role or will impact the property price asked for, but we might incur an expenditure by taking in a new property. But we have to assess to determine whether the market value of the property is over a certain amount. But we haven't determined it yet because we haven't proceeded to this yet. Well, if we wind up with a property that we can't do anything with, but if that individual purchases, or if an individual purchased that property, do you know how much it's going to cost an individual to purchase this and demolish the building that's there and remove the gas containers or the petroleum reservoir that's underground? Well, it could be that there might be some other properties that were sold off that were initially contaminated. Well, you see, each and every year, I know this, each and every year, the cost of this property, to maintain this property, rises about $5,000 to $6,000. Are we going to leave it like that until hell freezes over, really? You're not going to make any money with that. If we're spending $35,000, it's not all, to maintain this property. We can't, drag this property along on the tax rolls for the next 10 to 15 years. Mr. Wilson certainly might take care of that. He's our bylaw enforcement officer. Let's continue to speak in French so he won't know what we're talking about with regards to this. Mr. Desnoyers? Well, I believe that, look, of course, it stands to reason that you saw, that you noticed in the newspapers that this property was put up for sale, of course, through public notice. There was a site, Tri Market is its name, that takes over those properties that are in a troubled state, if you wish, without going through a real estate agent proper, but if we go through a company that deals with the properties that are difficult for us to sell off, might be helpful for us. But if an environmental study is commissioned and yields negative results, there won't be any possibility for, it won't be possible for us to resell it to a purchaser that's ready to assume a risk. But if we are, for example, ready to get rid of it overnight at a discounted price, well, look, the risk that you're taking is that if an individual is ready to purchase for $80,000 or $85,000, that's not what he's saying. He's saying instead of the municipality incurring the risk, let's have another entity incurring the risk. Maybe the environmental study might yield status in which that property might not be contaminated. Now, if that individual states, for example, well, I'll assume the risk, some will assume the risk to purchase it and say, well, maybe it's not contaminated. And if it's not contaminated, the individual might say, well, fine, I wound up with a great deal. Why would we, the City of Clancy and Rockland, assume that risk? But we'll have to sell off the property with regards to the value of the taxes. Oh, wait. No, the way things work out right now. At this point in time, the minimum that we can impose is $99. But if council states, well, we're ready to reduce its value by $20,000, we can obtain financing sources for that $20,000 reduction. So the minimum amount might become now $70,000 instead of $90,000. But we haven't received anything from the $90,000 because those taxes are in arrears. If we received $70,000 or instead of $90,000, it's much better. Well, this is already being taken accounted for, has already been taken accounted for in our accounting procedure. If we don't sell it, we'll incur a loss of $90,000. Well, we haven't, and it hasn't been listed through MLS. Well, if we receive an inferior offer, I hope that we'll be approached as a council saying, well, listen, we'd only received one offer, let's come up with a figure here, $80,000, and the onus will be upon us now to decide whether we can sell it off at that or not. Yes, this is one of those things we might consider, but you know, the fact that there are many things that come into play with regards to that property might lead us to implement measures that we might not initially like to implement. Well, let's say that if ever we're caught with this property that remains unsold in 2 years, that we might stop increasing the amount or accruing amounts. Well, look, this building has an accrued amount, you know. Mr. Desnoyers will come up with an answer. Well, of course, if we're talking about $5,000 or $6,000 worth of interest, this is the amount we'll be losing either today or in 5 years from now. There's really not a difference. I would suggest that we continue on with this property right now as things stand, and let's hope that it's going to be sold off. It's not easy to take a decision with regards to this situation, but there are no existing scenario that will guarantee that this property will be sold off either today or tomorrow or next year. Well, we'll be called upon to wait for another year now, given the existing purview of the bylaw. Well, why don't we just reduce this by some $20,000 and have people bid on it immediately? if we leave it at that price, you have some leeway to negotiate. We might as well leave it at $90,000 and have a bit of leeway to negotiate this. I know you don't like this. Well, we can't negotiate with regards to with a tax, from a tax perspective. We can't negotiate this. Well, we can come up with a minimum of 70,000, and people can bid up or down, or bid up, should I say. We can't negotiate with someone, but you can set down the price as a starting price. Well, fine. And we can also, the write-off of those taxes that have remained in arrears can be written off from the purchase price. There are chances that this could be sold off by $90,000. Well, look, the property itself is worth how much? Maybe $90,000? Well, I don't know. Well, there are demolition costs to be considered. Yes, but that's already a subdivided property. It's $90,000. Well, you might just buy it, Madam Councillor. No. I don't want anyone to assume that risk. I don't want to assume it either. It's just that it has it really has not been advertised. It has not been advertised everywhere. Properties at that price will be purchased. Look, he can advertise as much as he wants. He's confident that it's a good decision. Oh, that's fine. Look. Yes. Look. He just wants to get rid of it. There must be reasons why it has not been sold. It has not been sold because it has not been advertised enough. Well, some other properties have not been advertised. They were sold off. Okay, let's go on to the vote here because, well, who's in favor to have Frederic do what needs to be done? I move that we reduce it to $70,000. Mr. Mayor, do you realize that by doing this, in essence, that you're incurring an expenditure of $20,000 now? You know that. Well, let's not start off at $90,000. Even if we're left with a one-year period to get rid of it, let's try to sell it off at $90,000. And then we have to wait for a further one-year period? Well, it won't be $90,000. It's going to be in the vicinity of $100,000. Well, the value of the property will be increased then next year. Mr. Mayor, you're the boss. We can vote on this resolution. If not, we can go to another resolution. We're going to vote on what Frederic has proposed and to advertise it at $90,000. Who's in favor? 1, 2, 3, 5. All right, so passed and implemented. Great then. All right, Laurier Street revitalization update, Mr. Zant. Yes, Mr. Mayor, thank you. Let's go on now. Mr. Zant, the floor is yours. Mr. Mayor, that report number INF 2019-025, which provides an update. Are you lost in all of this, Mr. Zant? I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor. I'm not reading off the proper documentation here. Sorry. Just go ahead, Mr. Cardarelli. That report number INF 2019-025, which provides an update on the Laurier Street revitalization project, be received as information. Seconded by Mr. Cardarelli. Questions? All those in favor? Carried, and thank you. Item 9.3, Mr. Bouchard. That report FIN 2019-023, which serves to present a list of contracts over $50,000 awarded by the administration for the period from April 15th to May 31st, 2019, be received as information. Seconded by Mr. Simard. Any questions? Yes. Frédéric, could you include a column as to how much it's going to cost us, if there are any economies to be or savings to be realized with regards to this project? Well, the purpose of the report is to deal with the contract option. So what you're asking right now might not be necessary. So in theory then, these things should be over and done with. Well, these contracts will not be brought back for further discussion at the next report. Only those dealing with the grants. But at the end of the year, however, we'll be dealing with those. So this report, Mr. Mayor, is contained in the budget. All of those projects that are deemed to be scheduled for completion, they're contained in the schedule that's before you. Mr. Leonard? Fine. Mr. Lalonde? You're okay. All those in favor then? Carried then, that's fine. Item 9.4, floodplain regulations. Mr. Cardarelli? That report number AME 19-44-R, which outlines the policies surrounding renovations or reconstruction of a house located within a floodplain overlay under the zoning bylaw, be received as information. Seconded by Councillor Bouchard. Questions? Councillor Lalonde. Is it 49-1 or 45-1? I see. 45.1. It's a 2-year plan then. Fine. So historic levels deal with 44-1. I see. Well, in example number 3, dealing specifically with new constructions in a vacant lot. Why, given what we know now and chances of this situation repeating itself, why would we authorize new construction on a vacant lot as opposed to what the lady that appeared before us 2 meetings ago stating, well, she's going to demolish her cottage, put on a trailer, and she's just asking for a zoning bylaw modification. I have no problem with that because she'll be removing the seasonal structure during the fall. Why are we then putting up a house in a floodplain when we know what's going on? I don't understand. Do we have the capacity as a city to say no, or are we caught with provincial legislation where we have no choice? Well, really, there's a lady on Pagot Road that stated that she was going to move her house further back, further up. That's a permit that might be considered. The house is already there, but why are we creating? There are some laws that state that we don't have the right to build on a floodplain. Well, item number 3 is complicated because we're talking about an overlay and not a zoning project. It's a residential zoning with an overlay on a floodplain. So you could ask that the zoning bylaw be modified because you're raising the level of your house and it would not be in a floodplain. So if it was to be raised to a certain level, it would not be. Yes, but there's still some other contingencies to be taken account of, for example. Well, there's a new house, of course, on Wilson Street that was built. Look, by respecting those criteria, then this house, if it's raised at a certain level, would not be considered as being located in a floodplain area. So, in this particular instance, the roadway has to be built 30 centimeters over and above the level at which it is built at present to guarantee access. It's harder, of course, to resolve this particular situation because some streets are private. So municipal access, we have to create an access that meets those requirements. And then when we're dealing with private property, it's a bit more difficult. But example number 3 deals with a vacant lot whereby a construction might be put up there, or more building might be put up Well, you're talking about private roads. At present, we're in the process of paying for those private roadways that have been damaged by the flood to be repaired. So why is it the municipality pays to replace the roadway, but however they can do whatever they wish to do when they're on the private road? So we're caught in a quandary. Well, if it's a new home that would request that the roadway would have to be at a certain level or a certain height, yes, but it's on a private roadway. But it's not the only criteria, you know. If we don't have the power to request that the road be built in a certain way, but we're compelled, however, to be called in to repair the damages, it doesn't make sense, does it? Well, a new house on a vacant lot, well, the bylaw states on Voisin Street, for example, their access is already lower than has been determined. It's already a non-conforming existing use. But this one does not meet criteria. We're talking about new construction on a vacant lot in a floodplain that allows people to build on this. It's legal non-conforming, you see, and the only way in which we can go about circumventing this problem is to elevate the level of this house. And this does not apply to those properties along the river shore, but in Saint-Pascal. Well, Voisin is a private roadway, and the Saint-Pascal example is also a private roadway. But in any event, 45-1 specifically deals with those located along the river. Well, those people in Clarence and Rockland and surrounding neighborhoods say, okay, we understand, we sympathize with those people that live through those situations. But let's not encourage further development along those areas. If the provincial government turns around and says, well, okay, enough is enough, we're not going to pay this to municipalities anymore, then we're caught, you know, footing the bill for those situations. Now, what we're requesting is this: if this is enacted, there's no risk that the municipality will incur if it allows further constructions along those at-risk areas. That's all I want as a guarantee. I just want to make sure that we have control, even though it's private roadway, that we require that the roadway be at least 30 centimeters, 30 meters, should I say. Well, if it's a vacant lot, we're dealing with a vacant lot. Yes, fine, fine. Even though this is a private roadway, that's fine, that's fine. Yes, because you still have access to a house. It's not a private roadway. We're talking about a driveway. The same conditions would apply. You're in the process of saying at this point in time that if there ever was a vacant lot, an individual that would like to build a house on a vacant lot, the Voisin Road would have to be raised to 40 centimeters from this existing level. So it makes construction there impossible. Well, that might be a criteria that one might use. There are other similar type situations or similar type conditions that might come into play with other constructions in other areas. But in essence, what you're saying is what it boils down to, really. Voisin Road. Well, I might be alluding also to Wilson Road, where some properties are also in that same situation, wind up in that same situation. If we were to prevent construction, they'd be called upon to elevate the roadway to 40 centimeters from the initial 30 centimeters. But however, there are some variance situations that we might face, but the idea behind all of this is that the philosophy we should adopt is to reduce the likelihood of this particular situation reoccurring again. Fine, fine. We're just trying to come up with the best solution scenario. An individual has asked, well, why has the City of Clarence and Rockland not taken it upon itself to raise the level of our roadway? Well, they have to fit the bill. All those in favor, carried then. Let's go on. 9.5, Mr. Bouchard. that the Committee of the Whole recommends that Council approve bylaw 2019-62 for the Phase 8 La Violette subdivision, Plan 50M-292 being Charon Street in Rockland. Seconded by Councillor Simard. I do have a question. Why was this not done beforehand? There were many houses that were pre-existing at that point in time. Why is it now that we're assuming responsibility over this and not that we did not do so beforehand? Well, this particular section is rather new, and so there's still some new criteria to be respected that we need to implement. All lots have to be sold off before it's transferred to the City of Clarendon and Rockland? No, not necessarily. As long as the developments there meet with the standards set forth by the City of Clarendon and Rockland, then we're fine with this. And they've put down their second layer of asphalt there, did they not? Yes, at that area, yes. All those in favor? Carried. Let's go on now to item 9.6. Be it resolved that the Committee of the Whole recommends that Council adopts a bylaw to establish a prioritized standing offers list of engineering firms retained for their professional services as recommended. Seconded by Councillor Bouchard. Any questions? All those in favor? Carried then. Item 9.7, Mr. Lalonde. That the capital project list 2019 update, that this document listed as item 611 be received for information purposes. Seconded by Councillor Cardarelli. Questions? Mrs. Chouanière?
I noticed that in Bourget and in Clarence Creek, it used to be work in progress, and all of a sudden it's on hold instead of work in progress. So because we voted 2 years ago, we voted to have an assessment done so that like go on tender just to have proposals of what kind of systems could be done, you know, because I know it's not going to cost 88 million, you know, and so with those new systems now, it's really much cheaper now. So I don't know why it wasn't done, because it was approved by resolution, but it wasn't done. It's been postponed, and all of a sudden now it's on hold. So I want to know why.
So because
Oui, après ça, oui.
Yes.
Oui, après ça,
Well,
oui.
you see, it's on hold at present because we had to take a look at all components of that particular project. We received results today. It has an impact on this. Now, following a decision that will be taken from a council's perspective, it will direct us to what action can be taken with this project. Now, when it's on a hold, does that mean that the rebates do not accumulate anymore? No. We're just waiting for this process to be ended before we continue on. But money continues to accumulate with regards to the rebate being paid off. Yes. That impacts the management. Well, the fact that it alludes to $500,000 in one and $500,000 in another, well, the cost is a little bit less than half in the other. Clarence Creek will cost much less than Bourget will, but you've set down the same amount for both. Well, the $500,000 originally was reflected in the previous studies that were commissioned. At that point in time, we had not been presented with the cost that it would cost in Bourget as opposed to Clarence Creek. Now, further to studies that were commissioned and presented to council. Well, we're not talking about a system that will be connected to Rockland. It's an independent system that we're talking about. Yes. So now that you have a bit more details, it will be adjusted at the next study. Well, you've noted the impact. If ever you want to go forward with this particular project, you'll notice the impact that it will have with regards to that particular project and with regards to rebates paid or development charges paid. Will you want to continue on with the impact considered? Well, Limoges has sewers, Wendover has sewers. If we don't have any in our neck of the woods, then people will set up shop elsewhere and businesses will set up shop elsewhere. Well, I believe that the purpose behind all of this was to notice the impact that it would have on development charges and take this into consideration. There will be a directive handed out whether to proceed or not, determining whether or not we can recoup the costs or not. Well, the population also will have to determine whether they're interested in assuming a certain cost on a per household basis. Well, a resolution had been implemented and the budget had been set aside for this. We were supposed to go to tender and ask different companies to come up with some systems, to propose systems that would be best to cater to our needs. You know, if we were to commission one study that would be overseen by only one firm, it would not really all that ideal. Mr. Lalonde? Projects, I know that we talked about landfill projects also. I'm wondering if they'll be coming back to council for further review. I know that by the end of this year, with regards to our snow warehousing area, this area is, we need to come up with a new area or snow removal depot or area. Yes, we'll be coming up with new options. We need the minister's approval and all of this and all of that before we go any further. Yes, we're looking at those options. We're in the process of considering all options that are available to us. We can't speak to those options at present. I know we've entered into other similar type discussions. Also, let's not forget this one because it's going to cost us quite a lot. Line 21, the Jean-Luc Lennon Arena. Are we going to have news with regards to rezoning or further planning? We're talking about $110,000 amount here. This is a building we want to keep and transform. I just want to have an idea as to the delays involved in all of this. Mr. Boucher, at present, we're just doing a strict minimum with regards to work to be performed. It's not a priority concerning our list of projects. We've been dealing with this on many occasions, and we've capped it off at $110,000 to maintain a strict minimum amount to be paid off to ensure operation or daily operation. Now, we're awaiting further directives from town council. Well, when we're taking a look at budgets there, we'll have to consider the amount given out. Then might be the time to pay off more or pay off less. I brought this issue back because at a certain point in time we have to decide whether or not we're going to invest or leave things as they are. At present, we were given suggestions as to whether we're going to come up with something new or not. Let's think about Hawkesbury that transformed their arena into a multifunctional complex. When are we going to be presented options whereby we can be called upon either to reinvest or consider something else? I believe that the school makes use of this quite often. So, no, that's not what I'm asking, Mr. Mayor. And I'm completely in agreement with you, Mr. Mayor. If we give it a new vocation, the schools, we might take this in consideration, might latch on to this new vocation or new mission and make further use of it. Because we'd even stated previously that we did not like some options that were presented to us. We were presented options to scrap the ice rink area and turn it into a garage, but we decided not to go along with that. This is still in the works. Of course, we have to review it. Well, at present is that we should maintain the status quo, Mr. Mayor, at this point in time. Let's maintain it. And let's maintain the operational status of this building and see. Well, we'll have to take a decision concerning this sooner or later. We'll come up with options that will be presented to town council in the future. We'll have to come to a decision. Maybe this coming fall? Of course, yes. Mr. Bouchard? Well, quite clearly, I thought that we'd ask to come up with a price to demolish this building, to determine how much it would cost to demolish this. Yes, okay, I just wanted. to clarify this. We'd entered into discussions with the school board. There was a type of donation project that might have been implemented in conjunction with school board participation. Mrs. Chouanière, yes. The school board might be involved, and even the YMCA might become involved. If this is to be converted into a multifunctional complex, look, the YMCA has no money. I'm involved with YMCA. There is no money. Mr. Mayor, I'm just wondering if now is the time for us to come up with directives. Well, we've been given a directive by council in the past, and we'll come up with suggestions as to what can be done. Maybe in the month of August you might come up with alternatives, because we're off in July, right? If we were to give him a directive to have things remain status quo, well, fine, you know, let's keep status quo, but let's come up with other options other than converting this complex into a garage complex. So maybe, yes, I'll review the directives given to us, and I'll forward a report for information purposes to council. All those in favor then? Fine. Protective Services, 9.8. Mr. Grimard, please. Protective Services. That report PRO 2019-017 with regards to monthly statistics for the month of May 2019 be received as information. Seconded by Mr. Simard. Questions? Mr. Lalonde, general comment.
We need to step these up. Because right now we have one person who's doing that, but I don't see enough of an output to be blunt. That's it.
Autre question?
Any other questions? All those in favor? Carried then, thank you. Item 9.9, Mr. Cardarelli, that the monthly statistics stemming from the construction department be received for information purposes. Seconded by Councillor Levert. Any questions? All those in favor then? Carried. Any other items? Do any of you have any questions? Ms. Chouanière? Mr. Grimard? Just to review this situation, Avenue des Pins, Ward number 3, those residences on the south side, there's a property with a upward slope. We have to take care of this particular property. Yes, Mr. Lenhart. With regards to sandbags, where are we at with regards to this situation? What is your question? Well, in fact, we gave out a contract to remove those sandbags. Do we think that by the middle of August or September, everything will be removed? Yes, we've started to air out the sandbags today, and we'll be keeping council informed as to what progress there is. Well, we're expecting further directives, though, from council, where I imagine that necessary will be performed soon. As I stated, this company is not waiting for us to move, but we received directives from council to hire this company that meets with our criteria. That's not what I'm asking. If they're busy, and if we're asking, okay, when can you do this? If they come back in September and say, well, we're able to do this, well, that's part and parcel of the criteria that they had to meet, is that they had to remove those sandbags in a timely manner. I receive a lot of complaints, you see, because of this, and I understand the amount of sandbags involved. I understand this, but in 2017, sandbags had been removed much quicker than much faster than they have this year. Well, we had about $350,000 to remove, and people complained that we only dealt with one contractor. Now today we went to tender. It took a bit more time because it took us 2 weeks to go to tender. We obtained the results. It'll take a couple of days to decide whether or not this company is able to perform the work that's required. We'll hand off the contract, and then things will be done. Well, I hope that at least it will be done in a timely fashion. Well, there's more than one company involved here. We're talking about 2 tender envelopes that were received with regards to the tender bid process that we entered into. So Mr. Cardarelli, on this point and this point alone. I hear different things from citizens thinking that sandbags will be removed directly, remaining sandbags will be taken directly from their private properties. I can clarify now that this company that has been retained to remove sandbags will not go onto private property. People will have to bring sandbags to a collection area. Yes, that's right. And people will have to do this. Yes, to bring them to a collection area. I have another question. I received a few other calls, essentially.
So essentially where that 90 degrees is, there's been numerous accidents, I'm sure you're aware, that these have been happening more frequently ever since we have the surface treatment, right, correct? So is there, I guess I want to see if you have any recommendations at your department on what we could do in order to help safety, because this is, yes, speeding is definitely a factor, but if we could look at how we could maybe have, for example, signs a little earlier, just to make people aware that this is coming up. And having lived on that street for numerous years, I know that even friends of mine have gone straight through those. So just to help the situation out, so that the farmer doesn't have to keep pulling people out. Charge them. The wicked ditch there.
Mr. Mayor, I need to have a clear directives with regards to this. It depends, of course, of those people that need to be advised of the situation or appraised of the situation. If they don't make use of this street, then they're facing a different set of circumstances. But those people that speed up, of course, there's not much that we can do. We can't prevent them from speeding up there. But I think that definitely it might help out. You know, we might make people aware of the fact that the people should not speed up around the Rona development. Well, I can forward a report as to this. Can the department come up with a report, an analysis report, along with recommendations to possibly help out to enhance citizen safety? Well, when I was younger, there was a huge checkerboard panel along with a big yellow flashing light there that said, you know, slow down, or not to go straight ahead, not to proceed straight ahead because of dangerous roadway conditions there. Fine, we'll look into this. Yes, the directive will have to come from council. We're just asking you to come back with a report concerning this issue then. Well, that's fine. Well, Mr. Mayor, starting to get tired. Your eyes are drooping ever so slightly.
This is for that. A lot of complaints over dumpy-looking yards, and definitely in Ward 1, I'm sure that we all have those yards in our wards. So I was wondering if we could have more of a proactive approach to these yards. I understand our shortcomings that we have with staffing, but if we can still make sure that that's being done. Again, I do recommend my constituents to put complaint through with bylaws.
Through the mayor, we've already started that process, so lots of letters have started going to the front already, so we'll continue to be proactive in those regards. But the process is such that once we identify the issue, then they're sent a letter and given an opportunity to rectify the issue before we proceed with enforcements.
How long is that process on average? I guess there's different circumstances I can understand.
Typically, we give them a month from when we give them that letter to get everything tidied up. So
Okay.
they're given 30 days to resolve the issue. If they're not resolving, there are exceptions to that. But
So you give them a month to cut their grass?
again, typically they don't take that long.
Because they would, but before you know that the grass is long before you send the letters.
Yeah.
So, okay.
We need to revisit that bylaw.
Aye.
Okay,
So,
Monsieur
yeah.
Bouchard, thank you.
At the end of the summer.
Mr. Levert?
have one property you're saying 30 days on Drouin Street, and it's been 5 years now. And it's just keep getting worse. You guys have been there. They cleaned up. After they cleaned up, I guess the process starts over again? Is that the way it works?
Yeah, and I mean, it is what it is. We're obligated, if we're gonna do the work and force them to clean it up, so if the city's gonna take that on and expect to be recouped that cost, then we have to give the property owner a chance to correct it themselves.
But 5 years?
Well, but if it sounds like what I'm hearing from you councilors, that the issue has been raised, they start to clean up the property and then it falls into disrepair again. So every time they start to clean that up, they're making progress on it, so we have to assume the property is gonna make some progress. When that stops, then we can send them another letter. If they don't make progress on it, then we can come in and do it. The challenge with the municipality forcing itself on property owners to resolve the issue is potentially the property owner refuses to pay that bill or disputes the cost and says, well, I was gonna do that myself. And then the city spends a bunch of money on a property maintenance bill that won't never recoup. It's a cost recovery thing. We go cut the grass, we only recover what we can get back from that. So we have to get pricing on, we have to follow our procurement policy in terms of making sure that we have sufficient quotes for whatever work, and we can always be challenged.
I understand what you're saying, but you must have some paperwork from those 5 years that, you send letters and saying that the guy, saying, well, okay, I was gonna clean it myself. Well, he had 5 years to clean it himself, and how come it's never done? And people are complaining, that's why.
If you want to give me that address offline, I'd be happy to follow up with you, and Mr. Walton follow up with you.
Okay, Bob.
All right.
Do you give them a fine? Because if you were to give them a fine the first time, I don't know, $50 the first time, and then $150 the second time, they would clean it up much quicker. I don't know, like if you tell them and they don't do anything,
Yeah, but if you start getting fined the first time, there's people that'll clean up. I've seen that some people that have been warned and they'll clean up right away. So you're gonna punish everybody for the ones that are bad. Yes, Mr. Wilson.
just through the mayor, the previous direction from council was not to proceed directly with enforcement, so previous direction we received from council to try and educate the public on correcting the issue. So again, the challenge is they get long grass, they cut it, then the grass grows long again, educating them, they gotta cut the grass again, then they get long grass again, they gotta cut the
or
grass.
do we have to educate them 3-4 times? Like, I can understand the first time, it's the first time, like this, there are consequences, neighbors are complaining and so on, so on, this is educating. But then if they do it again, they are adults here, they're not children. So the second time, I think they should get a fine. Not the first time. I agree, you educate them and you explain to them why it's important that they do it. They live in the community and they have a responsibility. But going beyond that, because if it's like a child, tell them 10 times to do something, they won't do it. After 15 times, they won't do it. Under there are consequences.
All right. We can make a resolution to that effect, and we can revisit it at the next meeting. Well, should I come up with a resolution this time around or at the next meeting? Mr. Simard? I got one. I just got one. One? I thought you'd finished with your questions. No? He's got one left.
That slope thing, was thinking about that while everybody was talking. I understand the condo court, we voted on it, I know, but I understand the condo court gave us permission to do the slope and all that for the easement. And we're going to slope it, and not do the retaining wall. But what happens when we have to change that drainage pipe if we did the slope? We'll have to support the parking lot and all that, so we don't lose into the ditch when we dig to go get the pipe.
If you can envision the building in Rockland, through the mayor, you can envision the building in Rockland on the east side of that, towards the side of the Chinese restaurant, there's a drive-through lane that runs to the north. The main drainage pipe that's already there for stormwater drainage runs right down the middle of that laneway and at the north end into our existing parking lot and then into the stormwater system that's there. The issue is on the east side of that driveway, right at the back, where the property abuts the Washington Days condo court. So right now, there's a small section at the very back of that property, that in order for us not to do anything on their property, we'd have to build a retaining wall. It doesn't affect our stormwater drainage at all.
But when we have to replace it, don't we all have to support the parking lot and all that? Because the retaining wall is going to support.
There is no retaining wall.
No, if we would continue having the retaining wall. So when we have to dig to replace that pipe, which is a lot older than what everything else is over there.
This is brand new pipe that we're putting in the construction of the fire station.
That one, yes, but the existing one between the two properties, when we have to go do that, isn't that retaining wall holding the parking lot?
I'm not sure which pipe you're referring to.
The main drainage pipes between the two properties.
The stormwater drain that we're putting in, it's underneath our driveway. It runs from our catch basin
Yes.
and runs back on our property.
Question, if I understand correctly, is that there's an easement that goes north south. If that needs to be replaced, I think the issue is that would that undermine or you may have to shore so that because by excavating that, if you're excavating too close to the slope of your 3-to-1, then you may need to shore that. I think that's what the concern is. So I think
Wouldn't it be wiser to
have
have
that and say that it's not an issue or something.
I'm not sure which pipe we're talking about. I'm not aware of any other drainage pipes in there, so I'd have to get back to the council on that.
So even if it does, was it different?
No, but if you'd have the retaining wall that we wanted to
You're
cut,
still gonna have to do something so the retaining wall doesn't go in that hole when you dig.
depends how far the retaining wall is from that.
If you've got a slope, you won't have to, you just dig.
You just have to shore
I
it.
think his point is valid, maybe they can check it out, and if there's a problem, then come back to council, and we
More
may
than
have
happy to look
to.
into it. The slope is
Yeah.
6 feet. We're talking 6 feet in the back, 20 feet.
That I understand, the problem for that.
His point is valid, check it out, and if it's something, bring it back and we'll do a retaining wall.
Should that help?
Be more about holes than.
Well, I just like a copy of this document here. Yes, fine, because through my bionic eyes, I have a hard time making out the contents of this copy. Let's go on now to a closed meeting session.